The prairie stretched wide and empty, its golden fields swaying under the late afternoon sun. At the edge of that silence lived a man named Daniel, a rancher whose hands were calloused from years of hard work and whose heart carried a sorrow no one else could see. Daniel was infertile. He had longed for children of his own, but fate had sealed that door shut. Neighbors whispered about him, a man with land but no legacy. Every day he worked harder than anyone, maybe to drown out that truth, maybe to keep himself from breaking. His ranch was full of life, horses, cattle, sheep, but inside his house the silence was unbearable. One day Daniel rode into the nearby town to trade supplies. That's when he saw her, a teenage girl, no older than 14, dragging heavy sacks across the dusty yard of a workshop. Her small arms trembled under the weight, her back bent like a woman 3 times her age. The shopkeeper barked orders at her, shouting, cursing, while others passed by without a glance. Daniel slowed his steps. His chest tightened as he watched the girl stumble, nearly collapsing. Her face was pale with exhaustion, yet she didn't complain. She just lifted the load again, like it was the only life she knew. Something inside Daniel snapped. He asked the shopkeeper, "Why is she working like this?" "She's just a child," the man sneered. "She owes me. Her family left. If she doesn't work, she doesn't eat." Daniel clenched his fists. "That's not work, that's slavery." The shopkeeper laughed bitterly. "You want her? Take her. You got no kids anyway. Maybe she'll remind you of what you'll never have." The words stung deep, reopening an old wound. But Daniel didn't walk away. He stepped forward, placed money on the counter, and said firmly, "She leaves with me, today." The girl's eyes widened, fear and disbelief battling across her face. She shook her head quickly, clutching the sack like it was a shield. "No. I can't. He'll punish me, you don't understand." Daniel softened his tone. He bent slightly, meeting her gaze. "No one will punish you anymore, not while I'm here." She didn't move, she didn't trust. Years of cruelty had taught her better, but Daniel wasn't asking for trust. He offered her a choice she never had before, freedom. With a trembling hand, she dropped the sack. The sound echoed through the dusty yard like the breaking of chains. Daniel placed his coat gently around her shoulders. "Come on, child, you're safe now." For the first time in years, the rancher's empty heart stirred with something new. He didn't know it yet, but this frightened teenage girl would soon change his life in ways he never thought possible. Dawn. Walk from the workshop to Daniel's horse felt longer than any journey the girl had ever taken. Every step she took beside him was shaky, her eyes darting back as though expecting the shopkeeper to come running after her with a whip. Daniel kept his voice calm. "What's your name, child?" She hesitated, clutching his coat tighter around her thin shoulders. Finally, she whispered, "Eliza." Her voice was small, almost lost in the noise of the town, but Daniel heard it like a cry for help. When they reached his horse, Eliza froze. You're not taking me somewhere worse, are you?" Her tone was filled with suspicion, the kind that only comes from years of betrayal. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, Eliza. I'm taking you home, not as a servant, not as a burden, just as someone who deserves to be free." But before she could respond, a harsh voice echoed behind them. "Hey, where do you think you're going with my worker?" It was the shopkeeper, his face red with anger, his fists clenched. A few men from the town gathered around, curious, some smirking at the confrontation. Daniel turned, his expression firm. "She's not your worker. She's a child. And she's coming with me," the shopkeeper scoffed. "You think you can just buy her freedom? She owes me months of labor. She's property until the debt is paid." The word property made Daniel's blood boil. He took a step forward, towering over the man. "She's not property, and I just paid you more than enough." The man's eyes narrowed. "What's a rancher with no sons and no heirs doing with a girl anyway? You couldn't raise a family even if you tried." The crowd chuckled cruelly. The words cutting like knives. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He had lived with that wound for years, mockery, pity, whispers of his infertility. He wouldn't let them use it against him now. He placed a steady hand on Eliza's shoulder. "I don't need heirs to know what's right, and keeping a child in chains is wrong." The shopkeeper lunged forward, grabbing for Eliza's arm. She shrieked and tried to pull away, but Daniel was faster. In one swift motion, he shoved the man back, his voice ringing out across the square. "Touch her again and you'll answer to me." The crowd fell silent. Some of the townsfolk looked away, ashamed. Others stared, surprised at the rancher's fury. The shopkeeper stumbled, glaring at Daniel, but he didn't advance again. He knew better than to challenge a man like him in front of witnesses. Daniel swung Eliza up onto his horse, then mounted behind her. With a sharp kick, the horse galloped away, leaving the town and its cruel whispers behind. Eliza clutched the reins with trembling hands, still unsure of the stranger who had just claimed her freedom. Daniel leaned close and said quietly, "You're safe now, Eliza. Whatever your past was, it ends today." She didn't answer, but for the first time, hope flickered in her weary eyes. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the wind brushing across the open prairie. Eliza sat stiffly in front of Daniel, her small frame tense as though she was ready to jump down and run at any moment. Daniel noticed how she flinched whenever his hand shifted on the reins. He didn't blame her. Life had already taught her that adults, especially men, were not to be trusted. When the wooden fence of the ranch came into view, Eliza's eyes widened. The sprawling fields, the grazing cattle, the sturdy barn, all of it seemed overwhelming compared to the dark, dusty workshop where she had been living. Daniel dismounted first, then reached out a hand to help her down. She hesitated. For a moment he thought she might refuse, but then she placed her trembling hand in his. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said gently. "You're not a servant here. You're not anyone's possession." Eliza didn't answer. She followed him silently toward the ranch house, clutching the coat he had given her, as if it were her only protection. Inside, the house was simple, but warm. The faint smell of wood smoke lingered in the air. Daniel set out a plate of bread, cheese, and stew on the table. He slid it toward her. "Eat," he said softly. Eliza stared at the food suspiciously. "What do you want from me?" The question cut deeper than any insult. Daniel froze, then shook his head slowly. "Nothing. You don't owe me anything. You're free to eat or not. It's your choice." Her eyes darted between him and the plate. She waited for the catch, for the cruel demand that always followed kindness, but none came. Finally, her hunger won. She took a piece of bread, nibbling cautiously, ready to drop it if he lashed out. When nothing happened, she ate more quickly, tears springing to her eyes from the simple relief of food without punishment. Daniel sat across the table, but didn't stare at her. He let her eat in peace, pretending to busy himself with sharpening a knife. He knew trust could not be forced. It had to grow like a seed, watered slowly with patience. The days that followed were not easy. Eliza barely spoke. She often woke, in the night from nightmares, her screams echoing through the quiet house. Daniel never rushed to her room. He knew barging in would only frighten her more. Instead, he would sit in the hallway with a lantern, letting her see his presence steady and silent, until her trembling eased. By day, he gave her simple tasks around the ranch, not as chores, but as ways to make her feel capable. "Would you like to help feed the chickens?" he asked one morning. She nodded shyly. Her small hands scattered the feed clumsily, but Daniel praised her anyway. "They eat better when you do it. Must be your touch." She looked at him startled, as though compliments were foreign words she didn't understand. Little by little, her walls began to crack. One afternoon, Daniel found her in the barn, gently stroking the nose of his old mare, Daisy. "You like horses?" he asked. Eliza pulled her hand back quickly. I wasn't supposed to touch anything." Daniel smiled softly. "Here, it's different. This ranch is as much yours as it is mine, if you choose to stay." She frowned, confused. "Why are you being nice to me?" "Nobody is nice unless they want something." Daniel crouched down to meet her eyes. "Because I know what it's like to carry a burden you didn't choose. Because kindness doesn't cost me anything, but it might give you everything." For a moment, Eliza just stared at him, her lips pressed tightly together. Then she whispered, I don't believe you. Daniel nodded. That's all right, you don't have to believe me today, maybe not tomorrow either. But I'll keep showing you until you do. That night, Eliza lingered a little longer at the dinner table. She asked a question about the cattle, her first real conversation with him. Daniel answered patiently, explaining how calves were branded, how the herd moved across the pasture. Her eyes lit up with curiosity, and though she didn't realize it yet, that was the first seed of trust taking root. Daniel, the rancher who once thought he would never have a family, was slowly finding one in the most unexpected way. A broken child who had never known safety, and a man who had never known fatherhood. The road ahead would still be full of struggles, but on that quiet evening, with a teenage girl asking timid questions about ranch life, Daniel felt something stir in his heart again. Hope. For a while, life on the ranch moved quietly. Eliza was beginning to adjust to her new surroundings. She spoke a little more each day, smiled once in a while, and even laughed softly when the barn cat chased its own tail. Daniel cherished these small victories like treasures, but healing is never a straight road. Shadows from the past have a way of creeping back in. One morning, Daniel saddled his horse for a trip into town. Supplies were running low, and though he dreaded the watchful eyes of the townsfolk, he couldn't avoid it. He turned to Eliza before mounting. "Would you like to come?" he asked. Her eyes darkened. "No, they'll look at me." Daniel nodded, not pressing her. Then, "Stay here and keep Daisy company. I won't be long." But when he returned hours later, Eliza's face was pale, her hands shaking. She confessed she had hidden in the loft of the barn the whole time, afraid he wouldn't come back. "You thought I'd leave you?" Daniel asked gently. Tears welled in her eyes. "Everyone leaves. My father, my mother. They all left. Why wouldn't you?" Daniel's chest ached at her words. He wanted to promise he'd never leave, but promises meant little to someone who had only known abandonment. Instead, he sat beside her, silent, letting his presence do what words couldn't. The next struggle came from outside. Neighbors began to whisper. At the general store, Daniel heard them muttering behind his back. Strange, isn't it? A full-grown man living with a young girl. Maybe he wanted a daughter, but couldn't have one of his own. Still, folks don't like what they don't understand. Daniel kept his head down, but anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. He knew Eliza didn't need more suspicion and gossip weighing on her fragile heart. But gossip travels faster than truth. One afternoon, as Eliza walked with him through town for the first time, she heard the whispers herself. Poor thing. Wonder what he really wants from her. She looks too scared to speak. Eliza stiffened, pulling her hand from Daniel's. When they returned home, she avoided him completely. That evening, when supper sat untouched on the table, Daniel finally asked, "What's wrong, Eliza?" Her voice trembled. "They're right. Why did you take me? You don't even know me. You could have left me there. Maybe you just felt sorry for me." Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady. "I took you because no one else would. Because you deserved better than what they gave you. Not because I pitied you. Because I saw your worth when they didn't." But Eliza shook her head. "I don't believe it. People always want something." The fear was back in her eyes, sharp and unyielding. That night, when Daniel went to check her room, he found it empty. The window was open. Panic surged through him. He saddled his horse and rode into the night, calling her name into the vast darkness. Hours passed before he finally spotted her, walking barefoot along the dusty road back toward town. She carried nothing but the coat he had given her, wrapped tightly around her like a shield. "Eliza!" Daniel called out, pulling the reins. She froze, her shoulders hunched. "I shouldn't stay with you. People will never stop talking." "You don't need me ruining your life." Daniel dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the dirt with force. "Listen to me," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Let them talk. They don't know you and they don't know me. What matters is that you are safe and you have a home here." Her lips trembled. "But what if you change your mind? What if you realize I'm not worth it?" Daniel stepped closer, kneeling so his eyes met hers in the moonlight. "Eliza, You don't have to earn a place in my life. You already have it, and nothing will change that. She wanted to believe him. He could see it in her eyes, but fear still chained her heart. Reluctantly, she let him lead her back to the horse. As he lifted her into the saddle, Daniel knew their journey had only just begun. Trust had begun to grow, but resistance still lingered, like weeds threatening to choke fragile roots. And though he was willing to fight for her, the hardest test of their bond was yet to come. The morning after Eliza tried to run away, Daniel felt a heaviness in his chest. He could see the doubt still in her eyes, even though she had returned with him. He prayed silently that time would heal her fear. But fate didn't wait for time. Fate had its own test in store. It happened 3 days later. Daniel was mending a broken fence post when he noticed smoke rising from the far side of his property. At first he thought it was just a neighbor burning brush, but then he heard the frantic lowing of cattle. His heart dropped. "Eliza!" he shouted, sprinting toward the house. She stepped outside, wiping her hands on her skirt. "What is it?" "Stay. Here?" he said firmly, grabbing his rifle from the porch. "Don't move until I come back." But Eliza, stubborn as she was, didn't listen. She trailed behind him, curiosity and fear driving her forward. As they reached the north pasture, Daniel froze. There, standing near the flames of a deliberately set fire, were 2 men he recognized, workers from the very workshop where Eliza had been enslaved. "Well, look who it is," one of them sneered, his face twisted with malice. "The barren rancher and his little thief," Eliza gasped, shrinking behind Daniel. The taller man spat in the dirt. "She belongs to us. You think you can just take her away? She owes more than she can ever pay." Daniel's grip tightened on the rifle. "She owes you nothing. You've taken enough from her already. Leave my land before I make you regret stepping foot on it." The men laughed cruelly. "Your land? A pile of dirt with no future. What's a ranch without sons to inherit it? You can't even protect what's yours." Daniel's blood boiled, but he kept his aim steady. "I said leave." But before he could act, one of the men lunged forward, seizing Eliza by the arm. She screamed, kicking against him. Something inside Daniel snapped. In an instant, he raised the rifle and fired into the air. The shot echoed like thunder, startling the horses and silencing the men. "Let her go," Daniel roared. The attacker hesitated, but the other man pulled a knife from his belt, waving it threateningly. "You shoot me, old man, and she bleeds before you can fire again." Daniel's heart pounded. He could feel Eliza's terror, her small body trembling as she struggled. The odds were against him. 2 men, one armed with a blade, the other dragging her like prey. But Daniel had something they didn't. He had a reason to fight that went deeper than blood. "You want me?" Daniel growled, stepping forward, his rifle aimed directly at the knife wielder's chest. "Then take me, but if you so much as scratch her, I swear neither of you will walk away." For a tense moment, no one moved. The fire crackled in the background, the cattle bellowed in panic, and the prairie wind howled through the grass. Finally, the man holding Eliza shoved her roughly toward the ground. She stumbled, falling to her knees. The knife wielder sneered. "You're not worth the trouble, but this ain't over. You can't keep her forever." With that, the 2 men backed away, disappearing into the smoke and dust. Daniel rushed to Eliza's side, dropping the rifle as he knelt beside her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, but tears streamed down her face. "They'll come back. They'll never stop. I shouldn't be here. I'm only bringing you danger." Daniel gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Eliza, listen to me. I don't care if they come back 100 times. I will protect you. You are not a burden. You're the reason I fight." Her breath hitched. For the first time, the wall around her heart cracked wide open. She threw her arms around him, sobbing into his chest. Daniel held her tightly, his own eyes burning. In that embrace, something shifted. She was no longer just a frightened girl he had rescued. She was his daughter in every way that mattered. The fire on the pasture was eventually put out, the cattle calmed, the land secured. But inside Daniel's home, another fire had been lit, a bond forged in fear and strengthened by love. From that day on, Eliza no longer looked at Daniel with suspicion. She looked at him with trust, and Daniel, the man who once believed he would never have a family, realized he already had one. After the fire and the confrontation with the men from town, the ranch felt different. It wasn't just the scorched grass in the north pasture or the smell of smoke lingering in the barn. It was something deeper, something inside Daniel and Eliza. For the first time, she no longer kept her distance. That night, after Daniel had checked the fences and settled the herd, he found Eliza sitting at the table waiting for him. A bowl of stew sat steaming in front of his chair. "I tried," she said nervously. "I know it's not like yours." Daniel sat down, smiling softly. "Then it's perfect." He took a bite and nodded with satisfaction, even though it was far too salty. Eliza laughed, a small, shy laugh that filled the house in a way Daniel hadn't heard in years. That sound alone was worth every hardship. The days that followed became a time of healing. Daniel began teaching Eliza the rhythms of ranch life, not as chores but as lessons in strength and independence. He showed her how to mend a fence line, how to saddle a horse, and how to guide cattle across the field without spooking them. At first she was hesitant, her movements awkward and unsure, but Daniel never raised his voice, never scolded her mistakes. Instead, he would say, "You're learning. That's what matters. You've got a gift, Eliza, a rancher's gift." Her eyes shone. "Really? You think I could do this? Like I belong here?" Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her she belonged more than anyone ever had. Instead, he simply nodded. "Yes, this is your home, as much as it's mine." But the ranch wasn't just teaching Eliza. She was teaching Daniel too. For years he had lived in silence, burying his pain of never becoming a father. He had convinced himself he was destined to die alone, his ranch passing to strangers. But every time Eliza called his name, every time she asked a question, every time she laughed, it was as though life was being breathed back into him. One evening after supper, they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky burned with streaks of orange and purple. Eliza leaned against the railing, her face thoughtful. "Daniel?" she asked softly. "Yes, child? Do you ever wish you had a daughter?" Daniel swallowed hard, staring out at the land. "Every day," he admitted. There was a long silence, broken only by the chirp of crickets. Then Eliza whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "Then maybe you do." He turned, stunned. Her eyes were on him, timid but filled with hope. Daniel's vision blurred. He reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "If you'll let me, then yes, I'd be proud to call you my daughter." Her lips trembled into a smile. For the first time she didn't flinch at his touch. Instead, she leaned against him, resting her head on his arm. It was the moment both of them had been waiting for, the moment their wounds finally began to heal. As weeks passed, their bond grew stronger. Eliza began to hum while working, a habit. Daniel noticed with quiet joy. She decorated the small wooden table with wildflowers she picked from the field. She carved her initials into the old barn post, leaving a mark that said, "I belong here." Daniel no longer ate his meals in silence. He no longer walked into an empty house. Instead, there was warmth, chatter, and laughter, echoing through walls that had once felt hollow. Neighbors still gossiped, but Daniel didn't care. The townsfolk could talk all they wanted. What mattered was that the ranch was no longer just his. It was theirs. And in that shared life, both of them found what they thought they had lost forever: family. For Eliza, it was safety, love, and a father's protection. For Daniel, it was the joy of fatherhood, a legacy not built by blood, but by love chosen freely. The ranch was no longer a place of silence. It was alive again. Winter crept in slowly, covering the ranch in a blanket of frost. The mornings grew colder, the nights longer, but inside Daniel's home there was warmth, more than just the crackling of the fire in the hearth. It was the warmth of belonging, the kind that neither Daniel nor Eliza had ever known before. The ranch, once quiet and lonely, now pulsed with life. Every morning, Eliza rose early to help feed the chickens and scatter hay for the cattle. She had once been a girl who flinched at every sound, afraid of shadows and angry voices. Now she laughed when the rooster crowed too loud, and she hummed to the calves as she guided them to their pens. Daniel often found himself watching her from a distance, marveling at the change. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. One afternoon, after finishing their chores, Eliza tugged at his sleeve. "Daniel," she said softly, "can I show you something?" He followed her to the barn. On the inside of the wooden wall just above where she had carved her initials weeks earlier, she had etched another word with a small pocket knife. The letters were uneven, but clear. Home. Daniel's throat tightened. For years he had believed his land would be nothing, more than soil to be passed on to strangers. But now, staring at that word, he realized it had become something far greater. It was a place where hearts healed and lives were rebuilt. As Christmas approached, Eliza grew restless. One evening she sat by the fire with her hands folded tightly. In her lap, "Daniel," she began, her voice hesitant, "can I ask you something?" Of course, she looked up, her eyes wide with uncertainty. If I'm really your daughter now, could I call you Pa?" Daniel froze, overcome with emotion. No words came at first, only a lump in his throat that refused to let sound escape. Finally, he managed a hoarse whisper. "Nothing in this world would make me happier." The smile that spread across her face was brighter than any flame in the hearth. That night, for the first time, Eliza said the word aloud. "Good night, Pa." Daniel lay awake long after she had gone to bed, staring at the ceiling with tears in his eyes. All the years of loneliness, the bitterness of being childless, it all faded with that single word. He wasn't barren anymore. He wasn't empty. He was a father. The winter storms were harsh, but Daniel and Eliza faced them together. She learned to ride across snowy fields, bundled in layers, her cheeks red with cold, but her laughter ringing, across the land. Together they repaired fences battered by wind, carried buckets of water to the barn, and sat at night reading by lamplight. Each day, the bond between them grew stronger, woven into the rhythm of their lives. One evening, as they sat at the table sharing a simple supper, Eliza looked at Daniel thoughtfully. "Do you think the men who came after me, do you think they'll ever come back?" Daniel set down his fork and met her gaze. "Maybe, maybe not. But no matter what happens, you'll never face them alone. This is your home now. You're safe here, Eliza." She nodded slowly, reassured. Then she smiled. "I believe you, Pa. Spring came at last, painting the ranch in green once more. Wildflowers bloomed along the fields, and the cattle grazed peacefully. On a warm afternoon, Eliza raced Daniel's horse across the meadow, her hair flying in the wind, her laughter carrying far and wide. Daniel watched, his heart swelling with pride. For the first time in his life, he saw his future clearly, not as an empty house or a lonely rancher's grave, but as a legacy of love. The ranch would not die with him. It would live on in Eliza's hands, in her spirit, in her freedom. She wasn't just the girl he had rescued. She wasn't just the orphan he had sheltered. She was his daughter, his family. And in saving her, Daniel realized she had saved him too. The sun dipped low in the horizon, casting a golden glow over the land. Daniel stood on the porch, his weathered hands resting on the railing, as Eliza came running toward him, breathless and smiling. "Pa," she called, her voice filled with joy. "Come race me again." Daniel chuckled, stepping down from the porch. "You're on, daughter." Together they ran into the fading light, leaving behind the pain of the past and embracing a future built not on blood, but on love freely chosen. And so, the infertile rancher who once believed he was destined to be alone discovered the greatest truth of all. Family isn't given, it's made.